Hi, everybody. Welcome to vitamins. We are going to start with the fat soluble vitamins, which goes along with chapter 12. I'm going to divide this lecture series into two parts. It's actually quite long, and to be honest, the vitamins start to all sound alike after a while. So I highly encourage you to sort of break things up and pause and take notes to help kind of keep your attention span up. For this lecture series, we're going to start with just thinking about what vitamins are and know the definition of a vitamin and talk about characteristics of vitamins as a group. So not necessarily what's fat soluble, what's water soluble, but just what is a vitamin. Then we'll quickly shift into classification of the vitamins according to whether they are fat or water soluble. This next part, make sure you take good notes on and make sure you have a good understanding. The first thing you want to know is three important food sources for each fat-soluble vitamin. I find that students need to know this for this class, but also later on in other nutrition classes they might take. So knowing, if I say vitamin A, which foods you actually get that vitamin from. The next bullet point is also very important. You need to know the major functions for each fat-soluble vitamin. So what do they do? Why do we need them in the diet? You will also definitely have to know deficiency symptoms for each fat-soluble vitamin, especially the conditions in which vitamins are likely to occur. So, for example, for vitamin E, what happens when you have low intake of vitamin C? Often there will be a difference. What happens when you have low intake um, after a few days? Not as serious, but what happens if you have low intake over time? And how does that sort of build up? And who is most likely to get that type of vitamin deficiency? So, what are the conditions? For some of our vitamins, we also have toxicity symptoms caused by excess consumption. So that is certainly important to know. Not all vitamins are toxic, but quite a few of them are. And the last thing that we'll talk about is just thinking about vitamin and mineral supplements in general. Many of you probably take a multivitamin or maybe iron or vitamin D as a standalone vitamin. So thinking about what the potential benefits of that are and what might be some of the risks to health. And hopefully by the time we're all said and done with all of these vitamins and the minerals, you'll understand your own intake a little bit better and start to think about maybe some dietary things you could do to improve your vitamin mineral status, or think about if you might need a supplement or if you don't need a supplement. So let's start with some general facts about vitamins. So we'll say this a couple of different times. You should know what essential means by now. Of course you do, right? Essential means that you have to have it. Your body can't make it. Vitamins are organic, so they contain carbon, and they're needed in very small amounts. Most of us can get every single vitamin we need in the recommended amount in one tiny pill a day. So very, very small. You probably remember this from the beginning of the semester. Vitamins are not a source of energy. They have no calories. We need them for many different functions. We will get more specific, but sort of generally, they're important for energy metabolism. So how do we turn the energy in food into energy for the body, or ATP? We need vitamins and minerals, we're talking about vitamins today, so we need vitamins for growth. You need minerals for that too, but we'll save that for later. This is especially important for children, for pregnant women, to fuel that growth, development. Think about how our brain develops over time and our skeletal system develops over time. Those are just a few examples. Maintenance, this is really important for maybe some of our older population to maintain functional status, to um, maintain our body and our health over time. So we have two big categories. Today we're doing fat-soluble vitamins. There's only 4 of them. So A, D, E, and K are the 4 fat-soluble vitamins. They dissolve in organic solvents. Water-soluble vitamins, there's more of. It's all the B vitamins, and there's a lot of them, and vitamin C, and they, of course, dissolve in water. So just to quickly emphasize this again, vitamins are vital to life, so they cannot be synthesized by the body, or maybe they can, but they can't be synthesized in adequate amounts, so you have to get them through your diet. They are vital because if a deficiency develops, your health will decline. So we know that we need them. Some of them are even used as pharmacological agents. So an example of that is a B vitamin, a water-soluble vitamin called niacin. Some people take that under a doctor's order in high amounts because it helps. It works as a blood cholesterol lowering treatment, again in mega or high doses. And a lot of our vitamins you find in plants, which most people always think of fruits and vegetables, but some of our vitamins we also find from animal products. Now here we're still talking about vitamins generically, but there's a difference between fat and water soluble. So fat soluble vitamins, not surprisingly, are absorbed with dietary fats. In order to absorb them, it's just like absorbing fat. You need bile. And you need enzymes to break up the fat. So pancreatic lipase is an important enzyme. About 40 to 90% of fat-soluble vitamins get absorbed under optimal conditions. So meaning that your small intestine is functioning normally, you're not eating other foods that might interfere with absorption. You'll notice that it's not 100%, so some of fat-soluble vitamins are not absorbed, they get excreted. Water-soluble vitamins are not dependent on dietary fats. They are somewhat easier to absorb, and you can tell that because 90 to 100% of all your water-soluble vitamins that you intake end up getting absorbed into your bloodstream. So the small intestine is where we absorb most of our vitamins. If we are not absorbing, if absorption is decreased, we have to increase our intake. More must be consumed. So for fat-soluble vitamins, if you have any disease that causes fat malabsorption, you will probably have a problem with your fat-soluble vitamin status. We know that alcohol abuse interferes with many of our B vitamins, so that may lead to malabsorption of those B vitamins. And we know that some diseases may require vitamin supplements to prevent deficiencies, and we'll point that out as we go through all of them. You're by now used to seeing these pictures that highlight the order and what happens during absorption. So think about eating a food that contains vitamins, starts in the mouth, of course, when you're chewing. Um, in the stomach, as things start to break down because of the acid and the enzymes, you're starting to release some of the vitamins that are found in the food. We know that digestive enzymes produced by the pancreas also help release the vitamins from the food. Here's where we start to have differences. So fat-soluble vitamins only will require bile from the liver. And of course, we store a little bile from the gallbladder. That's going to help make that fat-soluble vitamin be absorbed. Um, Fat-soluble vitamins are absorbed in the small intestine along with dietary fat. And just like fats that we eat, they're carried by chylomicrons and they travel throughout the lymphatic circulation instead of the cardiovascular. For water-soluble vitamins, we're also absorbed in the small intestine, but we go right into the bloodstream. We don't need bile. We don't need it to be carried with other things. We don't need chylomicrons, for example. We're going to make one weird exception for vitamin K, which is a fat-soluble vitamin that we'll talk about today. So vitamin K is weird because you get it from your diet, but your body can also make it. All of that bacteria that lives in our large intestine can actually produce vitamin K. So a little bit more about transportation. I already said this, but we'll highlight it again. Fat-soluble vitamins are different from water-soluble because they're packaged and delivered with dietary fats and chylomicrons and lipoproteins. Chylomicron remnants, so small bits of chylomicrons, contain fat-soluble vitamins, and the liver is very good at repackaging these vitamins to transport them to cells throughout the body. Water-soluble vitamins are a little bit easier. They get absorbed in the small intestine right into the bloodstream and travel throughout the body that way. Storage is also different between the two vitamins. Fat-soluble vitamins are not readily excreted from the body. So more likely than water-soluble, they get stored. The liver is a common site of storage, and also our adipose or fat tissue, which kind of makes sense because it's fat-soluble. Vitamin K, again, is kind of funky compared to the others. That one gets handled a little bit differently. We'll talk about that later. Water-soluble vitamins are excreted rapidly. They go right through you. We don't tend to store them. Because we can't store them, we can't save up for a day when we don't consume too much. We actually need to consume water-soluble vitamins every day. Of course, there'll be exceptions to that, but that's the goal. B12 and B6 are exceptions in that they do get stored to some extent. So those aren't as critical to eat every single day. And you know this, vitamins can be toxic. The most likely vitamins that will cause a toxicity are from A and D. And this isn't just like, oh, I had a lot of vitamin A today. This is in amounts 5 to 10 times greater than the DRI guidelines. It's almost always people who are taking supplemental form of the vitamin where it gets to be too high. Supplements usually supply less than twice the daily value of vitamins and minerals. And if you don't have a true documented deficiency, that's probably the route you want to go so you don't have any problems with taking too much. All right, so as promised, this is now going to be all about the 4 fat-soluble vitamins. And we're going to start at the beginning of the alphabet. We're going to start with vitamin A. It's also a good one to start with because I think it's the most complex of the vitamins. So while I still have your attention, we'll go over vitamin A. So we're going to further classify vitamin A. So it's fat soluble, and we have retinoids, which is the form of vitamin A that comes from animals, and we have carotenoids, which is a form of vitamin A that comes from plants. So there's some pretty important differences between retinoids and carotenoids. When we talk about like vitamin A as vitamin A, we're talking about retinoids. This is the biologically active form. So when we have vitamin A in our body performing the functions of vitamin A, it exists as a retinoid. Another way to call this is preformed vitamin A. And if that's not enough, this preformed vitamin A or retinoid or just plain old vitamin A actually exists in 3 different forms. So if you looked at the chemical structure, it would have 3 different structures, and they can be interconverted. That means within the body, so again, sort of biologically, retinol and retinal and retinoic acid um, are somewhat, the body can make it into the different forms depending on what it needs. Retinoic acid is a little bit different. It actually can't be converted back to the other forms. Carotenoids, you've probably heard of. So when you think about yellow and orange fruits and vegetables, so the most famous example would probably be carrots. They are considered provitamins. So this is going to include alpha carotene, beta cryptophyllin, and they actually can be converted into vitamin A within the body, right? So you eat a ton of carrots, you probably know you're getting all kinds of beta carotene That's what you're eating. But once you ingest and absorb that vitamin, the body's going to turn it into the preformed version of vitamin A. And that's where most of again, the biological function of the vitamin happens. Now, I promised you we're going to have to know vitamin A in foods, all the vitamins in the food sources. So here's a good slide for that. Retinoids, remember, come from animals. So we get this from liver. I don't know how many of you are big lovers of eating liver. I don't think I've ever had it in my entire life. But since we store vitamin A in our liver, animals do too. So if you eat the animal liver, you will have a ton of vitamin A. We also get it from fish, fish oils, fortified milk, and eggs. So in this country, our cow's milk has vitamin A added to it. Carotenoids are from plants, so anything that is dark green and yellow orange has carotenoids. Um, Beta carotene is a type of carotenoid that has the greatest amount of provitamin A activity, meaning that it converts to provitamin A in the body very or more easily than the other carotenoids. About 70% of vitamin A in North American diet comes from animal sources, so we probably don't do the greatest job in our dark green and yellow orange vegetables and fruits. Here's a slide just also kind of giving you some ideas of where we're getting vitamin A and carotenoids in the diet. You can see also we list the RDAs. You will not be asked this. You don't have to memorize these numbers for any of the vitamins. You can kind of guess because we have quite a few foods and you really don't have to eat a ton in order to meet the RDA. This doesn't tend to be a real problem nutrient in this country. So here again are the recommended daily values. Again, please don't memorize these. You could certainly look them up. It's always in your textbook if you want to know. We do the RDA for vitamin A. We don't have specific ones for beta carotene or the other provitamin carotenoids. I already mentioned this, but average intake of both men and women meet the DRI guidelines, so it's not one that we tend to worry too much about. If you really want to get into the weeds, remember we have all these different forms of vitamin A and carotenoids, and they somewhat sort of interconvert. So we actually have this term retinol activity equivalence, which means that we're trying to have a common measure. So this will account for the different biological activity of retinol and carotenoids. So for example, retinol is our preformed vitamin A. It's the most biologically active. So 1 equals 1, right? And we're going to measure all the other forms of vitamin A relative to this. So beta carotene is not as biologically active. So it actually takes 12 milligrams of beta carotene to have the same biological activity as 1 milligram of retinol. So you have to eat more carrots um, where you could have just a small serving of something like liver for the same amount within the human body in terms of function. That's a little bit confusing. So read your textbook for more detail or ask me questions. A little more about storage and excretion. So 90% of vitamin A is found in the liver. So you probably have some in there right now. Your liver stores enough retinol ester to last several months. So you could theoretically have vitamin A, especially one of those proactive forms, have a big dose and then not eat it again for a few months. It is released into the bloodstream from the liver as retinoid bound to something called retinol binding protein and something called transthyretin. And we can excrete vitamin A via the urine, although it isn't easily excreted. So this is one that we're going to have to talk about toxicity. You do have to know all the functions for all these vitamins that we're discussing. So we're going to talk about vitamin A as a retinoid, so the biologically active um, form of vitamin A. It is an important vitamin. We need it for growth, development, cell differentiation, vision, and immune function. So when I was little, my mama always told me I had to eat my carrots. I still don't love carrots. And she promised me that I would see better if I ate carrots. So if you could see me now, you'd see my glasses are about 3 inches thick. My mother was, I wouldn't say she was lying to me. She didn't know the exact details of vitamins A role in vision. But we'll talk about that here in a second. So a little bit more about vitamin A and growth and development. This is really critical while a woman is pregnant. So as a fetus is developing into a full-blown human, that fetus really needs vitamin A. It's involved in the development of your eyes, limbs, cardiovascular system, nervous system. It's also important, and this is true for everyone, not just fetus, epithelial cells and mucus-forming cells in the lungs, trachea, skin, and GI tract. Because of its importance in growth and development, I already mentioned during pregnancy, especially the early stages of pregnancy, you need good vitamin A status in mom, and this is going to help protect against birth defects and fetal mortality. A little bit more about cell differentiation. So this is a lot of detail. Again, feel free to read in your textbook if I'm going too fast. So we know that retinoids bind to retinoid receptors in the cell nucleus. And if you look over here at the picture, here's our nucleus with our DNA. And here's our vitamin A. It has a little carrier with it. Um, and it's binding again to a receptor. So these receptors, if you think about it, it's kind of unusual for a vitamin to get into the nucleus and bind to DNA. Um, and these help regulate the formation of messenger RNA, which we need for normal gene expression. So gene expression directs cell differentiation. So what is that? I always think of differentiation is, what's the cell going to eventually evolve into? What's it going to turn into? So stem cells, which you may have heard of, we're thinking about using stem cells for treating diseases and things like that. They will eventually develop into a very specialized cell that has important function in the body. So this is kind of a long way of saying that you really need good vitamin A status. We're talking about a vitamin that interacts with DNA and really helps drive gene expression and cell differentiation. In terms of vision, this is where my mom got it partially right. Your retina, which is a part of your eye, is made of rods and cones. You probably learned that a long time ago. So rods are the part of the retina that help us see in low light. So it's a little bit dim and you can't see really great, but you can make out black and white and movement. Cones are the part of the retina that help us see bright light and colors. So for ideal vision, of course, our rods and cones are both functioning optimally. Um, this is, again, quite a bit of detail, but if you understand it, you'll know more than my mom. So look at that. We even have a little cartoon. Cool. So here is a blow up of your retina. So you see that dude, he's got an eyeball, and you see the retina, which is kind of behind everybody's eyeballs. And that cycle there is showing just how vision works. So in our rods, and I just saw that circled in red, we have retinol, so this form of vitamin A that binds to a protein called opsin, and that helps form another protein called rhodopsin. This can absorb light, so that's step two. And we also now have this important form of vitamin A, 11-cis retinol, that gets converted again. And again, this is a little bit more detailed than I'm going to expect you to know. But now we have opsin that is no longer um, bound to retinol. And that's going to trigger a cascade of changes that relay a message about what we're seeing to the brain. Um, Now that the retinol is not bound to anything, it eventually gets converted back to its original form, and that can now bind to opsin to make rod spin. So what does that all mean in normal terms? So on this slide, I've introduced all kinds of new names for proteins, and we're talking about very specific chemical forms of vitamin A. Um, but if you notice, we're really talking about vitamins A function on the rods. And the rods are the part, as we go back, that help us see in low light. So help differentiate between black and white. So what does vitamin A important for? It's really more important for your night vision. It has nothing to do with whether or not you need glasses. It has to do with whether or not you can see in low light. Here's another important function of vitamin A that we're probably all thinking about right now is our immune function. If you get infections more easily, that's actually an early symptom of vitamin A. So I kind of think of it as what's the first thing to go if your vitamin A status isn't great? You're not going to go blind right away, but you might have a compromised immune system. Vitamin A helps maintain that epithelium. That's really that protective barrier that helps protect the body against pathogens that might enter it. A good example, of course, is your skin. So you want good vitamin A status to protect yourself against that. If you also think about your skin and sort of turning over your skin cells, um, vitamin A helps with that. That's why we actually use certain analogs of vitamin A to treat acne, psoriasis, and damage from excess sun and UV light exposure. So vitamin A and Pro-A carotenoids and all those different types of products are found in skin creams, anti-aging formulas, also just special skin creams. I've seen it in shampoo and conditioners. Um, so we really use these in a lot of our products. You do have to be careful. Sometimes, if you put something on your skin, you're still going to absorb it. So you don't want to be overdoing it. You especially want to think of this if you're pregnant and monitor to make sure that you're not using too much. Talk a little bit about carotenoids. So even though these get converted to regular vitamin A in your body, they have some special functions all on their own. So we know carotenoids are also really important for your eyes. Specifically, they help prevent diseases of the eye like macular degeneration. Carotenoids have also been linked to lower risk of cancer and cardiovascular disease, probably because at least beta carotene is most likely a good antioxidant. Okay, so we've learned the functions. Now we're going to talk about what happens when you have a deficiency. Just to grab your attention, we've got some kind of disgusting looking pictures here. This is extreme vitamin A deficiency that would happen if you were quite deficient. It is very rare in North America because we don't tend to have a lot of problems with this vitamin. But it is actually a major public health problem in developing countries. So if you think about some of the countries in Africa or India, um, this is where we might see something like that. Worldwide, deficiency of vitamin A is actually the leading cause of non-accidental blindness. So this truly is a global public health problem. Because vitamin A is so important for your eye, if you have a deficiency, it can lead to something called xerophthalmia, which is what you are seeing here on the slide. This will cause blindness. I'm not going to say that because I'll butcher it, but it's abnormal dryness of your eye. Bitted spots, where you can actually see the spots on the eye. That's what this is. Keratocystia, where you start to have this sort of growth over the eye that is obviously going to impair vision. For your skin, follicular hyperkeratinous, you'll start to get kind of these scaly areas on your skin. Vitamin A deficiency in infants and young children can impair growth. Toxicity, vitamin A is actually considered the most toxic. The official disease associated with toxicity is called hypervitaminosis A. That's kind of easy to remember, right? It sounds like what it is, too much vitamin A. And we tend to see this in people who use supplements long term, especially if the dose of the supplement is 5 to 10 times the RDA. So really, you have to be careful about vitamin A supplements. You do not want to consume over 3,000 milligrams a day, so that is the upper limit. Carotenoids are a little bit different. So carotenoids are the ones that aren't as biologically active. They get converted to vitamin A. But the nice thing about carotenoids is if your body has sufficient vitamin A, it doesn't get converted and you can excrete it very easily. So not toxic for carotenoids. All right, so we have a couple different ways to think about vitamin A toxicity. Acute is one or more large doses of vitamin A over a few days, several days, right? So this isn't like years of too much vitamin A. This is a few days of too much vitamin A. So what will happen? Your stomach will hurt, GI tract upset. You might get a headache. You might have blurry vision, and you might have poor muscle coordination. Chronic is long term. And with chronic, this is usually the more dangerous. Joint pain, loss of appetite, skin disorders, headache, reduced minerals because it interferes with absorption, liver damage, double vision, hemorrhage, so excessive bleeding, and coma. Um, Vitamin A is tetragenic, meaning that it can cause spontaneous abortion and birth defects if a pregnant woman has too much. So consuming large amounts of carotenoids, again, does not resolve in the toxic effects. The only bad thing that we would notice with large amounts of carotenoids is um, hyperkeratinemia, meaning that your skin will start to turn orange, which is weird, but it's not harmful to your health. The most common time we actually see this is in infants and young kids when they start to eat foods. A lot of times they'll really like pureed carrots and sweet potatoes. So if they eat too much of these foods, they might start to get kind of an orange color to their skin. This is kind of a nice picture way of explaining what I just said. And it's really going to be true for most vitamins. You really want to be right in the middle, right? And have the perfect amount of vitamin A so it can do all the functions in the human body. We want normal growth and development. We want normal night vision or black and white vision. We want it to help with cell differentiation and gene expression and help our immune system. If we are deficient, if our intake starts to decrease, then we have all these problems that we already talked about. Worst case scenario, a true deficiency over time is so serious that it could actually cause death. Usually it would be in the context of other deficiencies. And vitamin A, again, is a very toxic vitamin in too high of amounts. It causes problems very quickly and acutely. It causes problems chronically. So if you have poor vitamin A over time, and it causes very specific problems during pregnancy and is considered to be tetragenic. It's so toxic that although this would be rare, the toxicity could result in coma and possibly death. Okay, so I think this might be, oh, you know what? I'm going to go through vitamin D. I'll divide them in half. So we're going to go through vitamin D and then we're going to take a little break. Vitamin D is kind of cool anyway, even though it's classified as a vitamin. It can be synthesized by the body in the presence of UV light. So this is why we often call it the sunshine vitamin. Um, if we probably understood vitamin D better as we were discovering all the vitamins, it's really more like a prohormone or a precursor of active hormones than it is a vitamin. One of the tricky things about vitamin D, it's not in a ton of foods. So you see the natural sources, these are all fish. I don't think a lot of us eat eel on a real regular basis. But the problem with that is, if you don't eat fish, your only common source of vitamin D is probably dairy products. But because it's not in a lot of foods, it is one of our more common deficiencies. You may have noticed that people talk about vitamin D2 and D3. So, commercially, vitamin D is available in two forms when you buy supplements, and we also fortify some of our foods with vitamin D. So, both D2 and D3 are very similar in structure. They're traditionally been regarded as equivalent or equal based on their ability to cure rickets, and most steps involved in the metabolism and actions of vitamin D and D3 are identical, meaning that, for the most part, we don't really have to worry if we're taking D2 or D3. So we were probably meant to get most of our vitamin D from the sun. For many people, it provides 80 to 100% of our vitamin D. But this isn't real simple. It's actually fairly complex because think about all the things that might impact our sun exposure. Certainly, there's certain times of the day where we get more sun, geographic location. So up here in the north, we don't get a lot of sun and it's farther away from us during the winter. Same thing with season of the year. We certainly get more sun in summer than winter. Age, so the older we are, the less we're able to make vitamin D from the sun. Skin color, so the darker your skin is naturally, the more it will block um, get making vitamin D from the sun. And sunscreen, which is really good at preventing sunburn and sun cancer, does unfortunately block the conversion of vitamin D from the sun in your skin. Vitamin D can be toxic, but prolonged exposure to the sun will not result in toxicity. As the sun makes vitamin D in your skin, the excess gets degraded. So sun exposure is not good for you, but not because of vitamin D. If you're curious, this is a pretty high level of detail that I wouldn't test you on real specifically. But these are the different kind of forms of vitamin D and how that process happens in your skin. So in our skin right now, we have something called 7-dehydrocholesterol. And when sunlight hits that, that gets made into something, the form of vitamin D that most of us would think of as vitamin D3, right? So you need that sun in order to make that conversion, and specifically it's the UV light in sun. Um, that can now enter the bloodstream and go to the liver and the kidneys. It's not until that process happens that vitamin D gets converted to its active form, calcitriol, which is what is really does all of the functions of vitamin D in the body. So a little specific about absorption, transport, and storage. About 80% of the vitamin D that we consume through diet gets absorbed in the small intestine. It's fat soluble, so it travels to the liver by chylomicrons. Vitamin D in circulation doesn't go by itself. It has to be bound to a binding protein for transport. In the liver, it gets converted to something called 25-OH vitamin D or calcidiol. We just talked about that. It also goes eventually to the kidneys and gets made into the active form of D. Um, so this is a regulated process. The formation of calcitriol is regulated by something called your parathyroid gland and your kidneys. So if your blood calcium levels are low, your parathyroid gland makes parathyroid hormone, and that parathyroid hormone increases production of calcitriol in kidneys and restores calcium balance. In terms of getting rid of vitamin D, it's mainly excreted from your bile. So here's a little schematic again of vitamin D if you like the picture form. So two sources, ultraviolet light or fish or fortified dairy products. Um, it's fat soluble, so it gets absorbed with dietary fat. Doesn't matter where the source comes from, it's always going to get bound up with a carrier protein and go to the liver. In the liver, it gets converted to the 25 form, and then in the kidneys, it eventually gets converted to the truly active form. So why do we need vitamin D? The most important in that bioactive form helps maintain blood levels of calcium and phosphorus, which is important for bone health. That's how most people remember vitamin D is be important for bone health. Vitamin D increases intestinal absorption of calcium and phosphorus, especially when calcium levels are low. So calcium and phosphorus are minerals. They're not vitamins, but they're an important part of our bone. And if we can't absorb them, so if we don't have vitamin D and don't absorb them well, it will impact your bone health. Vitamin D also releases calcium and phosphorus from bone to restore blood levels of these minerals. Um, so we use calcium and phosphorus for more things than just bone. So if the body needs them, it can retrieve them from bone, and vitamin D helps with that process. Okay, let's see here. Let's start with one. That's always a good place to start. So you have calcium in your blood right now. Your body actually very carefully regulates that amount of calcium. Um, of course, we get calcium from our diet, but we can also get calcium directly from our bones. If that calcium level is low, the body doesn't like it. So it's going to tell your parathyroid hormone to make more, and that's going to work on your kidneys. That's what that organ is. Because your calcium's low, your kidneys are now going to decrease calcium excretion. So you're not going to pee out calcium, you're going to keep it. And hopefully that will restore your calcium level to normal. Your kidneys are also going to help regulate this by increasing synthesis of that active or almost active form of vitamin D in the kidney. Um, that is going to increase calcium absorption in your small intestine. And again, all working to get your blood calcium levels back to normal. If you have high blood calcium levels, your body's going to store the extra in your bone. Vitamin D has also been investigated in its role in your immune function, secretion of hormones, and cell cycle. A lot of that research is still ongoing. It may help decrease the risk of infections and autoimmune diseases, including type 1 diabetes, and may protect against type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dementia, and cancer. So it's one of the more popular vitamins these days. So in terms of what happens when you have a deficiency, the common deficiency disease that we hear the most about is something called rickets. And you can very quickly tell if someone has rickets, as you can see from this picture. This happens when you have abnormal mineralization of bones in children. So the bones aren't strong and they'll actually become weak and bow under pressure. So you can see that his legs aren't straight; they're starting to bend because the bones are actually soft. You can tell because you'll have an enlarged head um, and joints in your rib cage, a deformed pelvis, and again from the picture you can see the bowed legs. So obviously this would be low poor vitamin D status, and this could be caused by fat malabsorption because vitamin D is fat soluble, a disease called cystic fibrosis, more common in dark skin because you don't get the vitamin D from the sun as well, low milk intake, and those who don't get a lot of sun exposure. So the adult version of rickets is something called osteomalacia. So it's basically disease of your bones. This is poor calcification of newly synthesized bones in adults. It can result in fractures or breaking of the bones. We tend to see it in adults with kidney or liver disease because those organs are both important for making the active form of vitamin D, impaired fat absorption, dark skin, and those who don't get a lot of sun. It can be toxic. Mostly, again, this would happen with supplementation, not from sun exposure or food sources, or you really couldn't eat enough food source of vitamin D to cause a toxicity. We do have an upper level set. You don't have to memorize these numbers, just know that it can be toxic. Um, if you do have a toxicity, it can cause excess blood calcium, so too much calcium in your blood, which is actually very dangerous. Calcium can start to deposit or build up, and calcium is a mineral, so you don't want that in your kidneys, heart, and lungs. Anorexia, because you lose your appetite, nausea, and vomiting. Actually can do the reverse and start to demineralize your bones or break them down. Weakness, joint pain, and kidney dysfunction. So certainly be careful about too much vitamin D supplements. Here's all your needs. Now, the recommendation is an adequate intake, and it's assuming no vitamin D from the sun. So this is just how much we want people to get from their food, beverages, and supplements. Breastfed babies should be given vitamin D supplements. We don't get a lot of vitamin D through breast milk. And that picture there is a liquid form of vitamin D that we would commonly give to a breastfed infant. All right, now is a good time to take a break.